By the winter of 1776, the American Revolution was already lost. Not on paper, not yet. 5 more years of brutal fighting remained, but an army that had just been chased across New Jersey, freezing, starving, and shrinking by the week, was one bad decision away from simply dissolving into the countryside. What kept 13 colonies from surrendering to the most powerful empire on Earth wasn't one miracle. It was 5 compounding failures on the British side, each one letting a doomed rebellion survive long enough to become a nation. The first mistake was made in London, long before a single shot was fired at Lexington. British commanders believed the colonies were a scattered mob of farmers who would break the moment they faced professional soldiers. General William Howe, commanding the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas, treated the war as a policing action rather than a real conflict. He had the ships, the training, and the discipline to crush the rebellion outright in 1776. Instead, after routing Washington's army on Long Island, Howe paused. He gave the retreating Americans time to regroup, time that should never have existed. An enemy that believes its opponent isn't serious rarely fights like the war is actually urgent, and that hesitation gave Washington's broken army room to breathe. The second mistake compounded the first: distance. Britain was fighting a war 3,000 miles from home, and every soldier, every musket ball, every barrel of gunpowder had to cross an ocean that took 6 to 8 weeks to sail. Orders from London arrived outdated before commanders in the field could act on them. Reinforcements meant to arrive in weeks took months. When Washington's army nearly collapsed in the winter of 1776 and 1777, British forces sat comfortable in New York, waiting on instructions and supplies that were still somewhere in the Atlantic. The war Britain was fighting on paper, and the war its generals were actually able to fight on the ground, were never quite the same conflict. Logistics, not muskets, set the pace of the entire war. The third mistake came at Saratoga in 1777, and it was a failure of coordination that should have been impossible for an empire with Britain's resources. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a plan to split the colonies in two, expecting reinforcements to move north from New York City to meet him. Those reinforcements never came. Howe, commanding the southern force, chose instead to capture Philadelphia, a symbolic prize that did nothing to support Burgoyne's campaign. Isolated, low on supplies, and surrounded by American militia that seemed to multiply out of the countryside itself, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of roughly 6,000 men. It was the first time in the war a full British army had been forced to lay down its arms, and it did more than damage morale. It convinced France that the rebellion might actually win. The fourth mistake was diplomatic, and it turned a colonial uprising into a world war Britain was far less prepared to fight. France had been watching the conflict from the sidelines, eager for revenge after losing the 7 Years' War to Britain 2 decades earlier, but unwilling to commit openly to a losing cause. Saratoga changed the calculation. Within months, France signed a formal alliance with the United States, providing money, weapons, and eventually a navy that would prove decisive. Spain and the Dutch Republic followed with support of their own. What had been a regional rebellion Britain might have contained became a global conflict stretched across the Caribbean, India, and the European coastline itself. British ships and soldiers that could have reinforced the American campaign were suddenly needed everywhere else at once. The fifth mistake was the one that finally ended it, and it took place on the water off the coast of Virginia. By 1781, British General Cornwallis had marched his army into Yorktown, expecting the Royal Navy to keep the coastline open for resupply or evacuation if the position became untenable. Instead, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse arrived first, engaging and driving off the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. For the first time in the entire war, Britain lost control of the sea at the exact moment it mattered most. Washington's American forces, combined with French troops under Rochambeau, marched south and surrounded Cornwallis on land, while the French fleet sealed off any escape by water. Trapped, outnumbered, and cut off from resupply, Cornwallis surrendered his army of more than 7,000 men on October 19, 1781. News of the surrender reached London weeks later, carried across the same ocean that had slowed every British decision throughout the war. In Parliament, the reaction wasn't disbelief so much as exhaustion. The war had already cost more than Britain's leadership could justify to a public growing tired of funding a conflict against fellow Englishmen an ocean away. one now entangled with France, Spain, and the Dutch as well. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had overseen the war from its beginning, resigned within months. Peace negotiations began in Paris, and by 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. None of these 5 failures happened in isolation. Underestimating the rebellion in 1776 gave Washington's army the time it needed to survive its worst winter. The distance and delay of transatlantic logistics meant British commanders were often reacting to a war that had already moved past the orders in their hands. The failure to coordinate at Saratoga cost Britain an entire army and, more importantly, its credibility. That defeat convinced France to intervene, transforming a colonial rebellion into a war Britain had to fight on multiple continents at once. And finally, the loss of naval control at the Chesapeake, for one critical stretch of days, sealed the fate of an army that had marched confidently into a trap it never saw coming. Britain's soldiers were skilled, its navy was among the most powerful in the world, and its resources dwarfed anything the 13 colonies could field on their own. What it lacked was the coordination to use those advantages when it mattered, and the humility to take an underestimated enemy seriously before that enemy had allies, momentum, and an ocean's worth of misfortune working against the empire that once seemed unbeatable. The revolution that Britain expected to end quickly instead became the war that cost it an empire's newest colony. One delayed order, one missed rendezvous, and one lost naval battle at a time.